Waggoner, and I'm going to present to you today my recent work conducting a factor analysis on incarceration rates in the United States. I worked with Dr. Junsu Lee, who is a professor of economics in the Culverhouse College of Commerce, and he specializes in econometrics, which led him to use those econometric methods to evaluate incarceration rates and what affects them. Some very important prior research that has been conducted with faculty at the University of Alabama is the study by Dr. Pecorino, which evaluated the racial disparity in incarceration rates. And that created the source of our data set that we would use to evaluate certain gender groups and race groups separately. The three primary objectives that I've set for my research consist of aiming to determine the proportion of incarceration rate in each state that is determined by a certain national and regional factor. I'd also like to create a regression between some of these proportions that we determine to understand how the proportions are influenced by other factors in the United States. And I would like to generate conclusions to see if something like a certain individual state would have a strong influence over the entire nation's incarceration rate. So some of my primary responsibilities when working with Dr. Lee started out with conducting literature reviews and reading over prior studies that have an important impact over the methods that we are using and the data that we are studying. I cleaned the data to ensure that it had all values inputted and was available to be processed in the methods we were using. I conducted what is known as a principal component analysis, which I'll explain later, and a dynamic factor model. And I'm in the middle of creating regressions with this data, as I mentioned before, to understand the influences. At the end of our research, which is still underway, I am going to draw some sort of conclusions and create a summary material of what I have done. The data that we are using comes from state-level prison populations from 1978 to 2016. This was gathered by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in their National Prisoner Statistics Survey. We crossed this with population data from the United States Census Bureau in order to calculate an incarceration rate per 100,000 people. It was broken down by gender and race from each state into four groups, which are white males, black males, white females, and black females. And an important thing, the data was missing a good number of values, and so we used the prior 3 years data and the following 3 years data and averaged those to fill in a single missing year. Methodology that we used was the dynamic factor model is our core methodology. It is conducted using MATLAB, and it creates a correlation between several different factors in the state. The graphic on the screen displays how a national factor, regional factor, and state factor are all summarized to create what is the state incarceration rate that you see in that prisoner statistics data set. The principal component analysis has been the focus of my research this semester, and this is more of a lean version of that dynamic factor model. And the core difference between it is that it can only use 2 factors. So we took the national factor and the state factor to summarize that state incarceration rate. It is a lot less mathematically complex than the dynamic factor model. I am using in this presentation our black males analysis as an example of the type of results that we gathered. The chart on the board, the map of the United States, is the darker blue, the closer those states are related to the national rate. Whereas the more yellow states, especially New York, New Mexico, and California, are very independent from the nation as far as their incarceration rates are concerned. I've blown up the data for Alabama, and we can see that approximately 91% of their incarceration rate is influenced by the nation as a whole. So, based on that, we can determine that a change of 100 in the national incarceration rate would lead to a change of 91 in the Alabama incarceration rate. We are able to split up our data in order to create different charts from that component analysis. And here we have a chart for an earlier time period prior to 1997, and then the years between 98 and 2016. You can see how there are some clear regional shifts where California, Nevada, and some other Pacific Coast states seem to be becoming more independent from the national factor, whereas the East Coast states seem to become closer related to the nation as a whole. And I combined those and used the differences to see how the states changed from the earlier period to the later period. This graph further reinstates that the West Coast became a little bit more independent. And I'm excited to see what the dynamic factor model will say when we are able to evaluate regions as a group. Some of these results that we've seen have led me to wonder what caused these changes. So I have created a regression using the correlation data from that later half of the years, and I regressed it with, on the left, population density, and on the right, African American income. I thought that these might influence the correlation of incarceration rate because each state, if a state had a drastically different income, I thought that might lead to them having drastically different incarceration rates. However, the regressions that I made had very little statistical significance, which led me to believe that population density and African American income had very little correlation with the national relationship. Some of the things that I would like to see our research do in the future: in the next semester, we hope to continue regressions with the principal component analysis results, as well as conducting that dynamic factor model. In the long term, I'd like to draw some conclusions, which may take the form of a said state significantly drives the overall national incarceration rate, or something like the national factor spiked in a certain year, possibly explained by a national policy enacted in that same year. I'd also like to analyze a few other factors, such as income, type of crime, and family status. I'd like to see how these influence the rates as far as the dynamic factor model is concerned. Our long-term impact of this study is very relevant to today. It can help policymakers when they are trying to prevent racial or gender bias in law enforcement. It can also identify differences in policing between states and regions because the models study the relationship between those states. And I think the most important thing is it can determine whether national or local policy will be more effective when trying to create incarceration or policing reform. This way, the data that we have can determine whether something at the national level or something at the state level is more influential on an individual state. Also, for you and me, very relevantly, current events perspectives are provided by this research. It is often in the news that we see something about bias in incarceration, in prisons, or in our policing, and I believe that this study can provide valuable perspective as far as that is concerned. Here's some references that I have evaluated over the recent course of our study, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me now or over email in the future.
So this is obviously a pretty complicated topic. Did you have any major setbacks, and do you think any of those influenced your data in any way?
Yes, our data, since it was gathered over a course of many years, there were many changes that occurred, and one of these changes in the federal prison system led us to have to ignore 13% of the prisoners in America because they were in the federal prison system. They changed the way that they counted Hispanic prisoners in 2011, which we could not work into our study, so we only used state prisoners. And also, some states had large gaps in their results. Those were Vermont and Washington, D.C., which had to be omitted from every single group that we were studying. And in 2000, the census changed the way that they identified people of more than one race. And this led us to use an alternate data set that the census provided that double counted for people of more than one race. But we used growth rates from before they double counted these people to adjust those numbers accordingly.
So earlier in your presentation, you talked about how there was a very high correlation between states when you look at these rates. Why do you think that the rates are so high?
One thing that I believe is that the national application of policy had a significant influence over these rates, because when you have a national bill that influences every single state, and it might change the policing across the board, leading to a pretty much common increase or decrease in every single state. We also, national media is commonly read by people across the United States, creating a lot of common attitudes and behaviors that might lead to these high rates of incarceration. And a third thing that I believe might influence this is the high rate of people who move between states. The dynamic factor model and the component analysis are often used in their econometric sense to evaluate European nations and places where people don't commonly move between. But I believe it was near 29% in 2010 of the United States that moved their residents, which is very high and can lead to a lot of common attitudes, backgrounds across states.
I noticed that you focused only on Black males. Are the results for other genders and race groups similar to those that were displayed?
Yes, they were. As far as our charts go, where we have a large number of states that are in that darker blue and highly correlated with the national rate, that's very similar across the board. The individual states that were those outliers, where here it's New York and California, that varied, but the general pattern with a lot of outliers or with a few outliers in most states highly correlated was common.